So I'm actually pretty excited about this talk because it's the first time Bart and me are going to do a joint presentation. And we needed more time before submitting our abstract because a lot of thought went into actually the title of this talk and putting together this talk all in all. So we want to talk about how radical is SDT's universality claim. But before doing that, I actually would like to express our gratitude to you, Rashmi, and to your whole team for putting together this conference. I still remember 2 years ago when you started actually the organization, and you have been meeting multiple times. So thank you so much for doing it all. We have been there ourselves in 2010, and I want to highlight here that in 2010 we had an excellent band playing on the night after dinner, and Rashmi secured us that it would also be an excellent band who is going to play this conference. So we look very much forward to the band tomorrow night. The work that we are going to present is actually work done by our group. There are a number of people involved, as you can see, and there's also work done in harmony with and close collaboration with Leen Harens and her group. But let me start with a couple of daily examples to introduce the topic. And here is Julia. Julia has 3 different children, and she says the following about them. I have 3 children, and they're all very different. How I interact with the youngest is very different from how I interact with the oldest. You need to take their personality into account. If not, it's very hard to connect with them. Here is a judo coach, Jean-Marie, and he says some athletes may need gentle guidance, but others just need pressure. If you don't pressure them, they will not train hard enough and will never excel. So I'm introducing those 2 here because it speaks to the issue of need of interpersonal differences in the functioning of these athletes and children and the extent to which socializing agents can take those into account. And here is a statement for all of you, and we invite you to actually vote. If you want to vote, you need to go to the following website there, and there are 3 options. One option is I agree. One option is I disagree with this statement. I'm going to read it aloud in a minute. And then the last one is it depends. So it's the following statement. There are no universal ingredients for a motivating socialization style. A motivating style that works for one person has negative effects for another person and vice versa. So 3 options. The pin is there down, indeed, 84894. So there are no universal ingredients for a motivating socialization style. A motivating style that works for one person has negative effects for another one and vice versa. The votes are coming in. And it seems like if you look at this graph, like a minority of you are agreeing with the statement, then we have 40% almost that disagrees, and then I think we have 50% of politicians in the audience here. and they say it depends. So if we go back to the slide set, then I think there are 2 ways how we can think about this statement. On the one hand, I think, and that's a continuum, you could be a radical universalist. And what are radical universalists claiming? There is no room for variation. All people benefit or suffer equally from the same growth-conducive and growth-impeding circumstances. So for them, the idea is one size fits all. So the same solution is working for everyone. And then you have the radical relativists. And I'm moving to the other side of this podium here, because they are claiming there is no room for universalities. The effect of a demotivating practice depends entirely on the child's personality, age, cultural background, and situation. And I think the quotes of Julia and Jean-Marie were actually illustrative of indeed that relativistic perspective. Do we need to take this into account? So what is your perspective on this continuum? Are you a relativist or are you a universalist? And also, what's the position of SDT on this continuum? Some people have been claiming that SDT is actually a very radical universalistic perspective. And so we want to actually make you think about this issue and present some data that either speaks to the universalistic or the relativistic perspective. And so this talk would be successful for us if we manage to convey a more nuanced perspective around the role of interindividual differences in BP and T. Second, if we can say something about the proactive role of individuals in actually coping with need frustrations. And third, if we can illustrate how the psychological needs could be supported through different pathways. And so these are the three key goals of our talk. And we have organized the talk around 5 different parts. I'm going to open and talk about the need-conducive nature of need satisfactions and the vulnerability-enhancing role of psychological need frustration. We will then move on to the role of need strength, which may or may not play a moderating role in the effects of need satisfactions. Bart will take over and shift the focus to the social context and the extent to which a context is perceived to be need supportive or not. And then he will deepen that issue, focusing on the number of microprocesses involved there. And then I will come back and say something more about a circumplex model we have been developing and the role of the capacity for calibration. And so let me start off indeed here with the need satisfactions and frustrations, and all of you know about this, but I want to highlight here that there was a necessity to bring in the notion of need frustration a number of years ago. And I think the group by Nikos Ntoumanis and Kim Bartolomeu made that clear already from the beginning, that indeed need frustration involves more than the absence of need satisfaction. On the moment the needs get frustrated, it's really an active blocking of the needs. And so need frustration surfaces in experiences like pressure and conflict, rejection and loneliness, or failure and inadequacy. And so it's critical to study this, because the argument is, to the extent the needs get satisfied, you see indeed growth coming up. It means that the best in all of us awakens. But also we have vulnerable sides in us. There is like a kind of a dark side, which also could get activated under conditions of need thwarting, which give rise to need frustration. And in that moment, people become more passive. They could become more self-centered. There are all kinds of manifestations of the costs of need frustration. And so the metaphor we use here is one of poison. There's actually poison being thrown upon you, and then on that moment, indeed, the plant will also die off more quickly. Now, we have been collecting quite some data here around the role of need satisfactions and frustrations, and many of you may know this study, which was conducted in 4 of the biggest and most beautiful countries of the world. We have US, we have Peru, we have China, and of course, we also have Belgium. And in all of these countries, in university students, we would be assessing their need satisfactions and frustrations. We factor analyzed them and came up with 6 factors, and then examined to what extent need satisfaction and frustration would be predictive of those critical outcomes here. And so that's what you find here, which has been known now under the dual pathway model. Some people have called it that way because you have 2 pathways to either the bright or the dark side in people's functioning. But now one critical issue from a universality perspective is, of course, does that model depend on the country where you're living? Are all of these 4 different groups paying a similar price for need frustration? And then we found out that, in fact, the effects of need satisfactions and frustrations were not dependent on country membership. We moved on to other sociodemographics, that is, maybe age plays a role, or socioeconomic status, or gender. And in this study done with adolescents from Spain, led by Ana Marinos, she collected data among 1,000 adolescents, and we assessed again need satisfactions and frustrations. And what you see here, a similar model with the satisfactions and frustrations predicting the 2 outcomes. And then the question is, do those other sociodemographic variables, are they moderating those effects? No, they don't, except for 1 out of 36 possible interactions. So now we can conclude, indeed, those socio-demographic variables are not moderating the effects of the need satisfactions. In the meantime, people in this audience have been actually developing new versions of that basic psychological need satisfaction and need frustration scale, the Chen scale, from 2015. And you see here we have 13 language versions. We have all kinds of domain-specific adaptations. And if you have been developing a new one, Julien van der Kaap-Deder is actually happy to receive your new versions, and then we can spread them so that in the community we keep on using the same set of measures. Of course, there are other measures available than this one. I'm just highlighting here that we have a number of translations and adaptations. Now, do you have more evidence for the robust effects of need-based dynamics? Yes, we do. And one of the themes that is pretty intriguing to me is the interface between psychological needs and physiological needs. And I think many of us suffer from sleep problems. And this is the work done by Rachel Campbell, in this case, adolescents who would participate in a diary study. During 14 days, they would be wearing actigraphy to register their sleep objectively. They report in the morning on their sleep quality, they report at night on their need satisfactions and frustrations. And so what you see is that on days where need frustration is enhanced, goes up compared to the baseline, you see those adolescents are more stressed, and the stress then interferes with the sleep, both subjectively reported in terms of quality in the morning and objectively registered in terms of the number of hours of sleep they got that night. There is also a reciprocal relationship. So if you got up this morning and you felt like, I didn't have a very restorative sleep, well, that poor sleep quality is actually causing fatigue during the day. Maybe at this point you feel completely fatigued. By the end of the talk you will. And then this interferes with your need satisfaction today. So that suggests there is an interface between the two, a reciprocal relationship, which is also confirmed in this case in a sleep lab with patients suffering from unexplained chronic fatigue. And so then we moved on, and I think other people have also been talking about this. If the need frustrations are so critical, maybe we need to show evidence that they can explain the covariation and the co-development between different kinds of symptomatologies. So if they are so critical, then they should be transdiagnostically predicting all kinds of problem behavior. And so in this case, we did a number of studies, one here conducted among eating disorder patients who would report on their eating pathology and on their depressive symptoms. And we focused on the co-occurrence. So to what extent are those two co-occurring in this group? And what you see, there is here an average positive correlation between the two of them. If you bring in need frustration as a predictor, it does predict the two of them. But more interesting also is here the fact that that covariation gets reduced. So it drops to a 0.16 here, suggesting that in fact there is something, maybe an underlying common source that explains the covariation between those two. In a study among adolescents, we focused here on the change in eating pathology and depressive symptoms over time, so the co-development. And what could explain their co-development over time was an underlying change in need frustration. So I think this kind of work starts to suggest that indeed there is something maybe very critical here about need frustration. It does play a transdiagnostic role. And then we had the idea maybe we should go to Mars. And going to Mars, in this case, Sophie Goumare, she actually conducted a study among crew members who were engaging in Hawaii space exploration simulation study. So they would spend with 6 crew members together 48 on Hawaii. And we would be assessing their need satisfactions every week. We would actually also ask for their vitality, their life satisfaction, and so on every week, and the commander would be rating the performance of each of the members every week. And so what you see, there is considerable variation here in the need satisfactions from week to week. This is across the 48 period. But more importantly, during weeks where they reported higher need satisfaction, they had all kinds of benefits. I'm not going to go in detail over this, but I can tell you, indeed, the need satisfaction had similar effects here in this case. So, given we were so boldly to go where nobody else has gone before, and the need satisfactions do work also among those crew members in a Mars simulation study, maybe we should just go on vacation and then have a drink there, and maybe the whole issue is solved. Because the need satisfactions work even for those 6 people. But of course, we went on. And there is more here. We don't stop our quest for potential moderators. Now we are focusing more to the psychological moderators. So instead of focusing on socio-demographic variables like age, gender, and so on, the question is, do other psychological variables moderate the effect? And here we focus on interindividual differences in need strength. And so maybe those interindividual differences may moderate the relationship between the need satisfactions and frustrations and the outcomes. And you may be familiar with the work in motive disposition theory, and a number of people here in this group also have been doing work at the interface between SDT and MDT. Of course, within MDT, they propose a different set of motives, and they focus primarily on interpersonal differences in the motives. They use rather implicit measures to do it, but I think one of the critical things is to what extent is this indeed, do they have valid measures? And this is a quote from Bush and Hoefer, who say, implicit motives are broad constructs with a lot of facets. So it's unclear when you look at these measures what exactly is being assessed here. And if that's unclear, to me, it's unclear. So if you're going to use this as a potential moderator of need satisfaction, but what is it here that is actually potentially moderating that effect? So from an SDT perspective, well, we would say we need a differentiated perspective towards potential differences in need strength. And so we differentiate between need desire, which is a more kind of a craving for new opportunities for need satisfaction, which is actually based in deficits in need satisfaction. And on the other hand, there's need valuation, or the importance assigned to the needs. And it's a more growth-oriented individual difference. And so maybe those two different kinds of moderators, well, they are maybe more specific than, let's say, the mixed bags we have when we look at this issue from a motive disposition theory. And so we happen to assess need desire and need valuation in a number of studies. And so the critical questions are the following one. Is need satisfaction beneficial only for individuals high in need strength? If that's the case, I think SDT is in trouble. Because the argument is it should be benefit everybody. The other thing is, are individuals low in need strength immune for the costs of need frustration? So if you find out somebody does not suffer at all from need frustration, how can we reconcile this with our universality claim? So these are critical questions. And so in this study I showed you earlier on, among the 4 countries, in the biggest countries in the world, we actually also looked at here desire as a potential moderator. So did desire moderate those effects? No, it didn't. So that suggests, even for those who don't value the needs, even for those who don't want to get them met, they may actually benefit from getting the needs satisfied. In a newer study, we looked at this in South Africa, but also among Belgian prisoners. In this case, we focused on autonomy as a need and used both desire and valuation, both implicitly and explicitly assessed. And we looked at whether this could potentially moderate the effects of autonomy on the well-being of these prisoners or the well-being of the South African adults in this case. And so we find evidence for, there were a number of interactions coming up, in total 18%, 18, so you can see it here, explaining between 1 to 4 incremental variance in the outcomes above and beyond need satisfaction as such. But what you see here, the interactions were especially a matter of gradation. And that means that the effects were more pronounced positive for some people. That is, for those actually, in this case, who valued having that need for autonomy met more. So the more you value it, well, the more you extract benefits from autonomy satisfaction in terms of vitality. And so we think it's really critical in writing up papers around potential moderators. Well, we need to take all of these things into account. The percentage of moderators, the amount of incremental variance, the kind of analysis you do. And it's my feeling sometimes that papers are written up in such a way that they're kind of biased towards the interaction. Well, they are oriented towards the interaction, while the main effect is actually doing the job. And there is some incremental variance then by potential moderators, which is not to be neglected. But I think in the end, the meta-analysis will show indeed how systematic it is. And these are other studies here, and in particular also the group by Schuler, but also Ken Sheldon has been doing moderation work then using measures from a motive dispositional perspective rather than from an SDT perspective. What would be problematic for SDT is a crossover interaction. And that means indeed what works well for the one person does not work for the other. So it's a crossover. If that that turns out to be the case, I think we're really in trouble. As long as it's a matter of gradation, maybe that's not so problematic for SDT whatsoever. And so I would be also very sensitive in using the term integration. Because for two theories to get integrated, let's take the example of MDT and SDT, they need to be based in similar meta-theoretical assumptions. They need to share that foundational view on human nature. And for me, that's not so clear for MDT and SDT. It is currently the case. And so that's, I want to finish here and turn it over to Bart. Bart, who will actually focus on the following question. Given that the evidence for the moderating role of need strength is limited and inconsistent, should we thus stop our quest for potential psychological moderators altogether? No, but maybe there is more room for variation at the input side of the needs that's at the level of the perceived contextual influences.
Hi everyone. I will now talk, like Maarten said, a bit more about the question whether certain factors can moderate contextual influences on need-based experiences and subsequent adjustments. So we shift the focus from the question whether certain factors like culture and personality moderate the need-based experiences themselves on developmental outcomes to the question whether those moderators, like personality and culture, can affect the degree to which the context affects needs-based experience. And to begin this discussion, I would like to show you a movie clip some of you may know. This is a situation where the French president, Emmanuel Macron, at a public meeting, was confronted with a teenager who called him by his nickname, Manu, which was considered inappropriate by Emmanuel Macron at that moment. And you will see in the movie clip, which was in the media all over the world, how Emmanuel Macron responds to this event. And I ask you to look at it until the end, and then to consider whether the response is adaptive, according to you, for all adolescents, whether it is maladaptive for all adolescents, whether it doesn't help to teach respect, to be more polite in the future, or whether it is neither inherently adaptive nor inherently maladaptive. The effect would depend on a number of factors. So you can already keep your smartphone ready to vote in a minute, but let's first look at the fragments before we do so.
Ça va, tu vas bien? Bonjour. Bonjour, ça va? C'est bien? Ben, ça va?
Ah, je la connais, ça va Manu?
Non, je suis pas ton copain. Non. Voilà, tu es là, dans une cérémonie officielle, tu te comportes comme il faut. Donc tu peux faire l'imbécile, mais aujourd'hui c'est la Marseillaise et le chant des partisans. Tu m'appelles Monsieur le Président de la République ou Monsieur. D'accord? Voilà, c'est bien. Et tu fais les choses dans le bon ordre. Si le jour où tu veux faire la révolution, tu apprends d'abord à avoir un diplôme et à te nourrir toi-même. D'accord? Et à ce moment-là, tu iras donner le son.
Okay, are you ready to vote? It's a little bit like the Eurovision Song Festival, which the Netherlands won. Congratulations, by the way. Thanks to the Belgian votes. Thank you, Belgium. Okay, one pattern we already see is that not too many people think this is an adaptive reaction for all adolescents. And I would agree. I think considered from an SDT perspective, Emmanuel Macron's reaction is kind of controlling, certainly towards the end. The teenager at some point apologizes, says sorry, but he totally denies this. He then starts lecturing about respect, and he is making insinuations even about this teenager wanting to start a revolution and not working well for school. So I think it's rather controlling in nature. And then it's interesting to see that opinions in this room vary a little bit about whether this is universally maladaptive then or not. Some people say that it's maladaptive for all adolescents, taking a more universal perspective. Other people say that perhaps it could be effective or it could work under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. And so it's interesting to consider further this question: what would those circumstances be? And how strongly would those circumstances moderate then the effects of an autonomy suppressive approach? So I think this is an important discussion, this issue of universality, because in various disciplines of psychology, including developmental psychology, research on parenting, which is my domain of expertise, there is quite a lot of relativistic thinking about contextual effects. And so people write books with desperate-sounding titles like "What Can Parents Do?" or chapters questioning whether you can say anything meaningful about the nature of effective parenting. As you can see also in these quotes, it has been argued that autonomy suppressing, controlling parenting can perhaps be effective and beneficial in more collectivist cultural contexts, because it would teach children about important, highly appreciated values. It has also been argued that kids with some temperamental traits might benefit from a more controlling approach. For instance, children with a more inhibited, shy, withdrawn temperament might benefit from this because it helps them, the pressure helps them to explore the social environment. And so I will focus mainly on this dimension of autonomy supportive, an autonomy supportive motivating style, because it's the more controversial dimension in SDT. And so it's basically about this basic attitudes where you show an inherent interest in the child's perspective, where you have an open perspective for the child's feelings and interests. And this basic attitude is then expressed in specific practices such as recognizing the child's feelings, offering choices, providing logical consequences like Geneviève discussed earlier today, providing a meaningful rationale, and so on. And that ideally then results in the feeling in a child that you can be yourself, that there's room for authenticity. The opposite of an autonomy supportive style is a more controlling, pressuring style, and a well-known example of such a controlling style is psychologically controlling parenting, where parents engage in strategies such as guilt induction, love withdrawal, and shaming. Shaming is what Rashmi did to us while introducing us to the stage. So regarding that dimension, we can again compare two very contrasting perspectives. And according to a radical universalist perspective, you would say then that autonomy support contributes to all children's well-being to the same extent. Controlling parenting would be equally detrimental to all children's development. The radical relativistic perspective would say that both autonomy support and control can be good for some children and in some contexts, and can also be detrimental for other children in other contexts. So then everything would be possible. Everything could happen. So I will now show some data relevant to this debate, and I will start with a set of studies examining the question whether effects of psychologically controlling parenting on adolescents' psychopathology, internalizing and internalizing problems, are moderated by Big Five personality dimensions. So this is a paper where we collected 2 samples of adolescents and their mothers. The adolescents reported on their parenting and personality, and both adolescents and mothers reported also on the developmental outcomes. In these data sets, we examined all possible interactions between psychologically controlling parenting and personality, and we found that overall, out of 30 tested interactions, only 5 were significant. So the number of moderating effects was quite limited. The most robust interaction emerging is the one you see here. High agreeableness appeared to buffer effects of psychologically controlling parenting on externalizing problems. Importantly, agreeableness did not moderate effects of psychologically controlling parenting on internalizing problems. So although agreeableness seemed to protect adolescents somehow against the externalizing cost associated with controlling parenting, they still paid an emotional cost for this type of parenting. So it appears as if personality, or the moderating role of personality, is a matter of manifestation. It determines the type of outcome associated with controlling parenting. In these studies, we also found convincing evidence that psychologically controlling parenting thwarts the basic psychological needs, which in turn then predict more psychopathology, both internalizing and externalizing problems. So personality did not strongly moderate effects of psychological control at the level of differences between adolescents and families. However, recent research from our group shows that autonomy-relevant parenting does not only differ between families and parents, but also within parents' own functioning on a day-to-day basis. As you can see in these graphs, the gray areas of these graphs, about 50% of the variance in autonomy-relevant parenting is daily variance, is daily ups and downs in how autonomy-supportive and controlling you are as a parent. So with regard to autonomy-relevant parenting, one day is clearly not the other. And this is a message I think many parents in the room will recognize. This, of course, then raises the question whether personality might moderate effects of psychologically controlling parenting at this level of daily fluctuations. If an adolescent receives more psychological control on a given day than usual, does personality cancel out effects of this daily surplus of psychologically controlling parenting? And this we examined in a diary study with more than 200 elementary school children and their parents. Again, we found that out of 35 tested interactions, only 3 were significant. So there were no strong, no systematic moderating effects to be found also at the level of daily fluctuations. And again, this interaction with agreeableness appeared again. So again, agreeableness buffered against the effect of psychological control on externalizing problems also on a daily basis. So the data again suggested that this moderating role of personality is a matter of manifestation. So an intermediate conclusion is that personality does not strongly moderate associations between perceived psychological control, need frustration, and psychopathology. And this is in line with meta-analysis recently showing and confirming the robust effects of perceived psychologically controlling and perceived autonomy-supportive parenting. So it seems as if as soon as children perceive parenting to be thwarting their need for autonomy, they pay some kind of price. As soon as children perceive parents as autonomy-supportive, they seem to benefit. This brings or raises another critical question. Given that there is little, if any, systematic evidence for the moderating role of interindividual differences in effects of perceived need support and need thwarting, should we now stop our quest for potential moderators? Again, we don't think so, because there might still be individual differences in microprocesses involved in people's appraisal of contextual events, so the way they interpret contextual events. And so culture and personality might play a role in the way an actual contextual event is interpreted and perceived by children and adolescents. And children may thus differ in the degree to which one and the same autonomy thwarting event, for instance, a coach giving negative feedback or a teacher saying that she is disappointed with a child, is actually perceived as being need thwarting. Maarten and me might also differ in the degree to which we suffer from the shaming used by Rashmi, the teenager in the Macron example. It might depend a little bit on his personality, whether he has a resilient or more fragile personality. It might make a difference whether this would not be a French teenager, but a Belgian teenager or a Chinese teenager. So all those differences might kind of determine the interpretation, the appraisal of the events. Importantly, I think there are limits to these interindividual differences. It is highly unlikely that a potentially controlling practice will ultimately be perceived as being an autonomy-supportive one. So that's, those are the limits, I think, of the nuance we want to make. So in a number of studies, we examined whether culture plays a role in the appraisal of controlling parenting. And we did so because psychologically controlling parenting is more prevalent in collectivist societies, is more normative, is more accepted. And because it has been argued also that controlling parenting might have a more positive connotation in collectivist societies, because it would convey important values highly appreciated in those cultures, such as social cohesion and interdependency. So in one study with South Korean adolescents, we asked them to fill out a measure of collectivism first, and next they read one of two different vignettes. One vignette was a controlling vignette, the other was more autonomy supportive in nature, and afterwards they rated their perceived control when evaluating the vignettes. In the controlling vignette, we used pressuring language. The parents set high standards and were engaging in a lot of monitoring. The autonomy supportive vignette involved more inviting language, had a focus on mastery rather than high standards, as you can see. What we found is that both adolescents, low and high in collectivism, rated the controlling vignette as being more controlling than the autonomy supportive vignette. However, the difference was less pronounced in the adolescents high on collectivism. Those adolescents appear to have a somewhat more benign appraisal of the controlling condition. However, even those adolescents still favored the autonomy supportive vignette over the controlling vignette. So the difference in terms of cultural backgrounds was a difference in terms of gradation. Collectivism did not fully cancel out, let alone reverse the effects of the controlling vignettes. In another study with the Chinese and Belgian adolescents, we again used the controlling and the autonomy supportive vignettes, and we added a guilt-inducing vignette. And we focused on guilt induction because it's an ambivalent practice. It can be interpreted in different ways. It can be perceived as being pressuring, but it can also have some informational value because it can indeed convey the importance of certain values. And this is the guilt-inducing vignette. We use statements such as, "Don't you feel guilty?" The mom also emphasized the sacrifices she had made for the child. "I'll do all of this for you so that you can study hard and get good grades." Interestingly, the Chinese adolescents had a more nuanced perspective on the guilt induction vignette than the Belgian adolescents. For the Belgian adolescents, there really was no difference between the generally controlling vignette and the guilt-inducing one. For the Chinese adolescents, the guilt induction vignette fell in between the autonomy supportive and the more generally controlling vignettes. So they felt that it had more informational value, perhaps, than the generally controlling vignette, yet it was still perceived as being more pressuring than the autonomy supportive vignette. So again, this was a matter of gradation. I want to add one extra point of nuance. So culture and personality can also affect not only the appraisal of actual events, but also the way you then respond to those events. So there might be different ways of responding to what President Macron, for instance, said, with some responses being more constructive, being more effective, and other responses being more dysfunctional and worsening the effects of the controlling events. And to examine this, we relied on an interesting model developed by Ellen Skinner and colleagues, differentiating between different responses to need thwarting events and autonomy thwarting events in particular. And so negotiation is a rather adaptive, constructive response because you state your own preference, you stay true to yourself, and you try to find a consensus with the adult person pressuring you. An example item is I would explain why I would agree or disagree. And then there are two other more maladaptive responses, compulsive compliance, which is a more passive and controlled type of obedience. For instance, I would do anxiously what is requested. And then oppositional defiance is another dysfunctional response where you would rebel against the request and do exactly the opposite of what is expected from you. And so we expected that negotiation, because it allows you to stay true to yourself, would kind of buffer effects of psychologically controlling parenting on problems, while the two more maladaptive responses, compulsive compliance and oppositional defiance, would make things worse. And this we examined in a longitudinal study with adolescents and their mothers, and we indeed found some evidence for moderating effects. As you can see here, oppositional defiance worsened the effects of psychological control on externalizing problems. So the green line is for adolescents engaging in a lot of oppositional defiance. So they seem to add fuel to the fire, making things worse in an escalating cycle of negative interactions with the parents. Compulsive compliance also had reinforcing effects on the effects of psychological control, resulting in a stronger association between psychologically controlling parenting and internalizing problems. Probably because with compulsive compliance, you don't stay true to yourself, to your own preferences and interests. Negotiation, and this is the green line, buffered against effects of psychologically controlling parenting, but did not fully cancel out the effect, let alone reverse the effect. So negotiation is adaptive, but also does not manage to fully reduce or reverse the effect of psychologically controlling parenting. Like I showed in the model before, personality and culture are likely to play an important role in these responses. And in very recent data, we indeed found that children who are low on self-regulation, who have a more impulsive, difficult temperament, are more likely to be rebels, to engage in oppositional defiance. Children with a more withdrawn, inhibited temperament, characterized by high levels of depressive affect, were more likely to engage in compulsive compliance. Again, culture also plays a role here. This is the same study with the vignettes as I discussed before. Here we found that Chinese adolescents are less inclined to engage in negotiation and more inclined to engage in compulsive compliance than Belgian adolescents following perceived need thwarting, which is in line with the idea that adolescents in collectivist cultures attach more importance to obedience. Somewhat surprisingly, there were no differences between the Belgian and the Chinese adolescents in terms of oppositional defiance. So both groups of adolescents seem to be inclined, at least, to defy against a pressuring parental request. So the moderating effects in contextual influences we have discussed so far, if any, seem to be mainly a matter of gradation, determining the degree to which the context influences outcomes. Also a matter of manifestation, the type of outcome associated with a need thwarting event, and also a matter of the appraisal of the event and the way you deal with it, the responses we discussed. And Maarten will now discuss a fourth nuance. The moderating effects could also be a matter of calibration.
Thank you. Thank you, Bart.
Maarten.
I want to start, Rashmi, with apologizing for Bart's reaction. It seems unfair, you can't say anything, you don't have a microphone, but I'm happy to resolve the issues between the two of you afterwards. So I will be talking here about the role of the social context and the critical issue of the capacity for calibration. And so we zoom in here on contextual influences, and I'm happy to present here a model, a circumplex model that brings together a number of motivating and demotivating styles we have been studying mainly in isolation in the past. And this circumplex actually refer to it as a compass because it provides some kind of guidance to socializing agents how to actually instruct and motivate others. So let me say something more about it. This compass was actually developed based on some new measures. We created new vignette-based measures in different contexts. we used multidimensional scaling analysis to have an insight in the way how different need supportive and need thwarting practices relate to one another in that circumplex. They were tested in different domains, both in the sport context, in the context of healthcare, in organizational context, and also education. And as I said, they combine a different set of both need supportive and need thwarting practices. And let me say something more here about the role of structure. And as Bart indicated already, I think we find it important not only to emphasize the importance of the building blocks of, for instance, autonomy, support, and structure, but also the basic attitude underlying that dimension. And so what is critical for a person who is structuring another person's or providing competent support is a focus on the process itself and the progress that, for instance, the athlete is making along the way. And so that seems very critical, also a sense of trust, because if the building blocks are applied, let's say, in isolation from that basic attitude, well, if they are disconnected, well, there's little competent support taking place on that moment, because it's done in a very mechanical way. And so in that respect, that's the combination of the two which is critical here, such that for the persons, there's a sense of mastery that unfolds over time. And so we tested this circumplex model in two different situations, live domains here. On the one hand, these were teachers, secondary school teachers, but also their students, and on the other hand, sport coaches, both those coaching team sports and individual sports, but also athletes from both of those two disciplines. And so we came up with a new measure, a vignette-based measure, which I think has a lot of high ecological validity. Our current measures, I think, sometimes are somewhat decontextualized. They're not specifically tied to a specific situation. And so when we subject all of these responses to multidimensional scaling analysis, you see a circumplex emerging. And within that circumplex, there is actually room for a number of areas. On the one hand, we have autonomy support. And autonomy support falls apart in more participative approaches where choice, dialogue, asking input are critical, but also what we called attuning approaches, where you try to attune to the interest of the child, for instance, by, for instance, providing interesting activities, but also giving meaningful rationales aligned with the perspective of the child. Close to autonomy support is structure, and one critical component of structure is the guiding the child along the process. So scaffolding would be part of that, being encouraging, giving positive, process-oriented feedback. But there is more to structure. There's also the clarifying approach. So by clarifying what is needed, a child can start to build some competence. Without knowing where to head to, it's very hard to build that competence. And then interestingly, next to clarifying becomes one of the two controlling areas, with the one being demanding, where the focus is very much on the behavior. I don't accept this behavior. You should, for instance, improve or act differently. If we shift from the behavior, no longer play indeed the ball, we start playing the person, then we become domineering. And domineering, an example of this, an excellent example is actually shaming Bart. So that falls there in the domineering area. And then we move to chaos, and at some point, if being domineering doesn't work, you give up altogether. And so you abandon the child. And then next to the abandoning one is more an awaiting approach, where in certain situations you wait till things unfold and then you act on that moment. So what is kind of interesting here is, I think all of these different practices come together in one model, and we believe it's like a helicopter viewpoint that is developed here. But on the one axis here is the need supportive versus the need thwarting style that emerges. And it's really the most critical axis here. But the other one would be one which represents the directiveness of the teacher or of the coach, with an awaiting and a participative area being low on teacher directiveness, for instance, but then you could be high on directiveness as a teacher, both in more need-thwarting ways, but more need-supportive ones. So both clarifying and demanding are indicators here of high directiveness, but the way how that happens is very different. And so what is also interesting, what is the anxiety of a lot of teachers and coaches is that by being participative, it turns into chaos. It turns into little is happening here, and I'm losing grip and control over this class. What is our concern That is, that clarifying turns into being demanding, and that's the first step towards becoming domineering and then abandoning the child altogether. So it kind of gives you a dynamic insight in how changes could occur in your different motivating styles along the way. Now, what is important here in our viewpoint is that we do not consider need-supportive and need-thwarting practices as distinct categories, but rather that we develop a more gradual approach. And what does that mean? In line with the circumplex, you see that each of these different areas correlate in a systematic way with outcomes. In this case, this is the quality of the teachers rated by the students at the end of the school year, and they indicate whether they would like to have the same teacher next year. And what you see is, well, the strongest correlations here are for attuning and guiding the most need-supportive areas. And then it goes down from clarifying to demanding, it becomes negative. Domineering and abandoning, the two most need-thwarting ones, have strong negative correlates. This systematic pattern of correlations shows up for almost any outcome. And I think we believe on that moment, if you show this pattern, it also means that you don't need to pit the one style against the other. We have been maybe pitting structure against autonomy support and doing regressions, and then there's a competition between them, but maybe that competition is not needed. What is important is this systematic pattern of changing correlates that you see here in this circumplex. Moreover, this gradual approach may help us to deepen our viewpoint on interpersonal differences, which is the key issue of this talk. So how? Because the different areas in the circumplex carry different degrees of need support. They have different need supportive properties. And so the attuning and the guiding are the most need nurturing ones. And maybe for them, we should actually expect fairly universal benefits to be associated with them. Yet the participative and the clarifying, well, maybe we call them more the need enabling. By setting, for instance, the expectations for what needs to be done regarding homework, it doesn't guarantee that a child is capable to actually competently do the homework. It just knows where to get to. That's clear, but more will be needed. So need enabling areas set the optimal conditions, but maybe do not guarantee by definition need satisfaction to occur. If we turn to the downside, let's say, then you have the need-thwarting approaches, and likely there will be universal costs to this. Psychological control, a key example of a domineering style, well, does have costs. The costs may be somewhat differently depending on personality. The gradations may be somewhat differently, but still everybody would pay a cost. But maybe for the awaiting and the demanding, well, that's maybe more a need-depriving area where there is more room for variation here, and maybe some children may pay less of a cost or a price for the demanding than the others. And so many roads lead to Rome. There are many pathways which go there. And so although that's the case, not all of them do. You got here in Egmond aan Zee, you didn't go to Rome. And also, some roads may be more reliable than others. So some may have more strongly need-supportive properties than others, and other roads indeed are not leading you to Rome altogether and may even cause damage to your car, so to speak. So there are some need-thwarting areas which cause problems for all of us. And so in this study, this is a study on choice where we actually zoomed in on the participative approach. We offered choice here regarding painting. These were children in primary school. Some got their preferred painting activity. The others were deprived of that. So they were removed from their preferred choice. And we then assessed their intrinsic motivation for that activity. And what you see here is that the indecisive children actually found the choice to be less motivating. So they benefited less from the choice. But still, as you see it here, the different lines go up. There are strong effects of choice here. They are somewhat more pronounced for some children than for others. And so what I want to highlight here from the circumplex is this is an example of a participative approach, but maybe for some children it needs to be combined with, let's say, guiding. Especially if you talk about choice, which is identity relevant, very critical choices in life, I think structure will be needed on that moment and guidance, so to speak. So how can socializing agents now take these interindividual differences into account when motivating others? Maybe there are three key ingredients here. The first one is, Well, you need to be aware of a number of building blocks. You need to know what does it mean to support the needs of the child. The circumplex will help you also in that respect. But there is more. We would argue if these building blocks are applied in isolation from that basic attitude, it will come across as fairly mechanical. So you need that basic attitude of curiosity, of openness, of a process focus, and maybe there's also the capacity for calibration. And calibration in this sense means that you know indeed which motivating practice may work best in a given situation for which person under which circumstances. So you kind of calibrate, you move along the circumplex and you pick the right strategy on the right moment. Some children may benefit from a guiding approach at some point and you shift to the participative, you combine it with clarifying. And so I think that's like a skill. Of course, it's maybe a very sophisticated skill, but it gives you an insight, okay, what can I do in order to optimally nurture the needs of the children all the time? I'm going to skip this, so I think it involves a number of steps. I want to go back to our initial question. Where does this talk leave us with respect to our opening question? Because the opening question is, okay, where can we position SDT on this continuum? And I think some people have been arguing we are maybe radical universalists. There is little room for variation. We would say maybe that's not the case. From an SDT perspective, there is the principle of universality without uniformity. So that means on the one hand, there are a number of universals, but there is room for variation. For variation in terms of the gradation of the effects of need frustration, the way how those effects manifest, the way how people interpret and cope with need thwarting environments. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think we can also take into account those interpersonal differences between children as socializing agents. And I think fundamental to a need-supportive individual will be that you do take those interpersonal differences into account to optimally maximize chances for need satisfaction ongoingly. And to do that, you would need a capacity for calibration, shifting along the circumplex, and on the other hand, the basic attitude of openness and curiosity. We would like to thank you for your attention.